and the blood of the saints cries out to God.
Be not afraid, my child, for the Lord your God has sent me, your boy, to respond to all of these silly little YouTubers and their silly little comments about this very real and problematic issue, climate change. Whoa! And the Lord has sent me to respond to this message in the format of a reaction video. Yippee! That's right, we're going to respond to two separate Christian YouTubers and what they've had to say about climate change. Who? What? Pints with Aquinas and RuslanKD. Whoa! And when we're done responding to these videos, in another video, I'm gonna give a little explanation as to why I think Christians ought to be concerned with climate change. But first, we need to define what climate change is so that we're all on the same page. So, if you will allow me, climate change refers to how the long-term average global surface air temperature around the world is rising due to human activity which releases greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. I love greenhouse gases. Some such greenhouse gases include methane and CO2. Are there others? I don't know. But the main human activity that is leading to all the greenhouse gases and what have you is... what do you think it is to go to school? Burning fossil fuels! That's right! Burning coal, gas, oil, etc. As when these things are burned, they release all sorts of CO2 into the atmosphere, leading to the heating. Now, since the Industrial Revolution, little history, we've been systematically burning fossil fuels. Very good at it even, for energy, but ever since the 19th century, we've been aware that the waste output, CO2, has this greenhouse gas effect. And this greenhouse effect, the results of burning fossil fuels, was then later confirmed in the 20th century. Now, what's particularly problematic about all the CO2 stuff is that, unlike, say, our ozone layer, which is able to relatively quickly recover once we change what we're systematically doing to destroy it, CO2, on the other hand, CO2 can stay in the atmosphere for a very, very long time. Oh, how long does CO2 stay in the atmosphere? 20 years, maybe 50 years? 300 to 1,000 years. That's right! Any CO2 we put into the atmosphere will stay in that atmosphere for a bloody long time unless there is some kind of carbon sink to capture the CO2. Wow. Which means unless the CO2 was captured, the stuff that we released back in the very early industrial period could still be in the atmosphere, heating up our funny little globe that we stand on. Yippee! Isn't that fun? Now, the increasing average global surface air temperature has a diversity of effects, which I will proceed to list. Includes, but is not limited to, weather changes, higher frequency of extreme weather, including more natural disasters, flooding, hurricanes, wildfires, melting polar ice, raising sea levels, famine, drought, and the dehumanization of those most impacted. Climate change! Climate change! So when we're talking about climate change, broadly speaking, that's what we're talking about. Global surface air temperature getting bigger because fossil fuels keep burning, releasing CO2, and we're not doing anything about it. The results of which are weather catastrophes. There you go, that's climate change. Now that that definition's over, let's get to responding to some of these Christian content creators. Beginning with Pints with Aquinas.
It's almost like the powers that be would prefer us to stay in our house, order Grubhub or Uber Eats, watch our porn and just rot.
Pints with Aquinas. Pints with the lads? Up the Ra!
Up the Ra, Nigel. I mean, I know that you said sorry, I know you're...
But you may also know him as Matt Fradd, or the silly little Australian Catholic podcaster who takes the format of mostly interviewing dudes, but maybe sometimes he doesn't. But you may also know him as the fellow who changed Capturing Christianity, Cameron Bertuzzi's mind from being Protestant to Catholic. Good for them. Very happy for them. As long as they're happy, I'm happy. But as for his content on climate change, he's done one interview elsewhere with a certain priest who was
and my heart goes out to you. God bless.
Defrocked, thank God.
This is the last stand for Christendom.
One could only hope. But the other interview that he did is the one that we're going to interact with today. Who's the interviewee in question? Whoa! Who would have saw? It's Jorbson.
Up yours.
Look, I've even got this little book. I didn't read it very much. I read it when it came out and haven't touched it since. Isn't that fun and exciting? Now in the roughly 20-minute section where Jorbson and friggin' Mr. Pints are talking about the environment and climate and what have you, they talk about a lot of things. Mainly Jorbson does. And for that reason, I just can't address all of it. However, I would like to have just a very quick overview. So if you would come along with me to a little overview of some of his arguments. What does Jorbson say? Take a siege, Jordan. What would you like to say for us all?
So who's pushing it and why are they pushing it?
Who's pushing it?
The climate change.
Cynical anti-humanists possessed by the resentful spirit of Cain, socialists, communists, and people who worship nature.
This presentation is an obvious straw man that appeals to the emotional predispositions of a primarily conservative audience by utilizing language that is inherently negative within the context of a conservative vocabulary. He refers to the people pushing climate change by all these names because he knows full well that it'll rile up the audience. It'll really get their little jimmies in a twist. And in doing so, it makes his opponents easier to attack. And so when his opponents do respond with a logically sound argument, there's no need to engage anymore. The audience has already been emotionally prepared to reject the defense, not because it was a bad argument, but because why would you want to engage with someone who's
cynical anti-humanists possessed by the resentful spirit of Cain, socialists, communists, and people who worship nature?
This is what I and I've heard others refer to as boogeymanning. Whoa!
What the climate apocalypse mongers do is they take a very small section of time, and that's a big problem. The time frame matters. You can't just pick the time frame that's suitable for your bloody hypothesis. And so you can say, well, carbon dioxide has been increasing over the last 100 years. It's like, okay, well, how about the last 500? How about the last 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, 150,000, 2 million, 10 million? What's your time frame and why? Well, I picked the time frame that's convenient for my hypothesis. It's like, no, you don't get to do that.
Problem with this argument is that if you do measure CO2 for as long as the Homo sapien has been on the planet, roughly 200,000 years, then the CO2 levels remain basically consistent compared to the levels over the last hundreds of millions of years. It's only over the last couple hundred years since the Industrial Revolution do the CO2 levels begin to climb and skyrocket and what have you.
This is NASA data. No one disputes this, by the way.
So when we look at this graph, people who talk about the climate crisis only really care about this part way over here, and not having this part look like this part. This part is actually very informative. When temperatures rose 10 degrees Celsius in 50,000 years, there was a mass extinction that killed almost everything that was adapted to living on Earth at that time. Seems like something to avoid.
Climate Time makes a whole video against this argument in response to some of the misinformation spread by Joe Rogan. Famous Petersonians.
Petersonian?
Patrick Moore actually believes that if we wouldn't have started to burn fossil fuels, the plants would have started dying in about 500 years. He actually believes that the fossil fuel revolution saved the planet.
Bloody convenient. So what Peterson's suggesting here is, a little bit of a climate apocalypse, I suppose, but additionally, it's just a demonstration of ignorance. He doesn't understand the connection between CO2 and temperature. What can you do? So, looking at this graph in front of you, it's a graph of CO2 cycles over the last 800,000 years. As carbon in the atmosphere goes up, so does temperature. As it goes down, so does temperature. Greenhouse gas moment. Pretty normal stuff. It's been going on for a very long time, if you want to call it that. So I got a couple points I want to make in order to demonstrate that Peterson doesn't know what he's talking about. One, as Climate Time demonstrates in the previous section, when temperatures rose 10 degrees over 50,000 years, that was an extinction level event. 50,000 years. And Peterson wants you to believe that in the next 500 years, there would effectively be an extinction level event. It flies in the face of what is predictable and what is expected within the context of basically planetary climate history. It doesn't follow any previously understood patterns in climate. It's just like, well, Peterson just says it and we're supposed to believe it. So that's silly. So that discredits his point. But additionally, if in the next 500 years, the CO2 would get so low the plants would start dying, because CO2 cycles take place over tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. And because CO2 is a greenhouse gas, I would like to suggest that right here, right now, we would already be in the middle of a catastrophic ice age. Because the volume of CO2 in the atmosphere required to freeze over the planet is not even as low as the volume required for the plants to start dying. And yet, Peterson he doesn't really seem to acknowledge this correlation between temperature and CO2, instead focusing on the much less likely catastrophic event of plants dying. But because he is so antagonistic to climate change and global warming, he's kind of forced into a position where he can't acknowledge the correlation between CO2 and temperature, and thus probably explains why he doesn't acknowledge this more pressing problem faced in his little imaginary possibility of what the future could have been. Interestingly, I think we can take from this and actually see that Peterson just kind of refuses to acknowledge that temperature to CO2 correlation. And so, actually also demonstrates the utter weakness in his methodology when he is talking about the climate crisis. So there's that little stinker. Third point. Planetary history is a very big thing, hundreds of millions of years, and suddenly in the next 500 the plants would start dying, we'd all be catastrophically destroyed. Big scary. But thankfully the Homo sapien was around, and they just happened to learn how to have an industrial revolution where they pumped so much CO2 into the atmosphere that it saved the planet. Whoa boy, and you should be thankful to ExxonMobil and BP that the fossil fuel revelation saved us all. My dude, this is fantasy stuff. Like, where do you come up with this kind of stuff, dude? It's wild. I don't know what to tell you, dude. It's just ridiculous. And rather silly. But moving on to the actual argument that we want to engage with. Jordan Peterson, what do you have to say for yourself?
The major consequence is that the planet is 20% greener than it was in the year 2000. 20%. This is NASA data. An area the size of the continental US has greened since the year 2000. Crop yield has gone up 13%. Right, okay. Where's the planet getting greener? Because you heard climate, global warming. The deserts are going to grow. Well, then it wasn't global warming because that turned out to be a scam. Then it was climate change. The deserts are going to grow. It's like, no, the deserts are shrinking. The deserts are shrinking because the planet is greening because there's more carbon dioxide. Okay, so why are the deserts shrinking? Well, because plants breathe, and they breathe through these pores called stomata, and when there isn't much carbon dioxide, the stomata have to be open, and then the water evaporates. And so if you increase the carbon dioxide, the stomata close, and that means plants don't need as much water, so they can invade the semi-arid areas around deserts. And that's what's happening. So I truly believe, I believe this to be the case. If you took a dispassionate look at the data, and you looked at the effects of carbon dioxide, the biggest effect, clearly by likely an order of magnitude, is the greening effect. It's like, well, is that good? The opposite was what was predicted, and the opposite was regarded as a catastrophe. Okay, so the opposite of a catastrophe is good. There's more plants and crops grow better. Okay, so what's the problem exactly? Well, you could make the case that it's still a very rapid rate of change, and any rapid rate of change has a destabilizing effect on, let's say, a given ecosystem. And so that's a fair objection, but if you're kind of fond of plants, 20% is a lot.
So Peterson argues that the climate scientists, they thought the Earth would get less green, more desertish. However, it was the case that the opposite was true, stating that since 2000, the Earth has actually gotten more green, roughly by the size of the continental US. He cites NASA data. He argues that this greening contradicts the desertification that climate scientists kind of just predicted would happen, concluding that global warming, kind of a grift. However, is Peterson correct? Has the Earth actually gotten greener despite the predictions that assumed otherwise? Yes. Yes, it has. This is because the additional CO2 in the atmosphere acts as an air fertilizer which fast-tracks photosynthesis, causing this greening effect that Peterson is speaking of. That greening effect is called Carbon fertilization. So plants, you went to school, so did I. They breathe in CO2, breathe out oxygen, we all benefit.
Stomata.
And so the more CO2 the plant has access to, the greater the photosynthesis, which will then lead to increased volumes of CO2 consumption from the plant, presuming that the plant can maintain nutrient levels, generally speaking. And additionally, this increased CO2 consumption may have a positive impact on climate change, slowing it down and what have you. So yes, due to the increased levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, oh boy, there is in fact an increased greening effect around the world, especially in arid locations where water is limited and what have you. Just as Peterson stated. Whoa! This must mean that global warming, climate, environment, it's not real. Climate crisis, false. Global warming, a grift. Is that what follows? No, it's not what follows. However, the problem with this whole argument is that Peterson uses air fertilization as an argument against climate change, neglecting to acknowledge the context of this subject in its wider picture. I got 4 points to make on that. First, whilst additional CO2 may benefit photosynthesis, those benefits have diminishing returns, especially due to nitrogen deficiencies. CO2 will increase photosynthesis, leading to a greater plant biomass. That means plant gets bigger. However, the plant will not be able to consume as much nitrogen as it requires due to the artificial increase in CO2, leading to nutrient deficiencies in our plants and inefficiencies to act as carbon sinks. Nitrogen deficiency is not going to have such an impact on our crops, that's because of fertilizer, but it will impact our wild plants. From what I gather, scientists are still unsure why excess CO2 leads to nitrogen deficiency, but they do seem to understand it does lead to that. Thus, this greening effect due to the additional CO2 in the atmosphere can only go on so much. Secondly, as for the impact on crops, whilst greater CO2 levels will lead to greater crop yield, whoopee, contributing to an aforementioned greening, it will also have a negative effect on nutritional content for human consumption, namely with iron, zinc, protein, and other such micronutrients. Consequently, the more CO2, the greater the crop yield, the lower the nutritional value, effectively turning our crops into junk food. Scientists believe that this could lead to an increase in global malnutrition, something that has already impacted the global south and could then in the future impact the global north. Third, carbon consumption can only keep up with so much of the carbon output from fossil fuel production. So as long as carbon emissions from fossil fuel production exceeds CO2 consumption by our carbon sinks, then we will continue to add more pollution to the atmosphere than our ecosystem can capture. Furthermore, if nitrogen deficiency caused by excess CO2 has a negative impact on our plants as carbon sinks, then despite the greening of the globe, our carbon sinks are still becoming less and less efficient at carbon capturing. Fourth, because CO2 is still a greenhouse gas, it will continue to heat the global surface air temperature, causing weather irregularities, drought, which will lead to soil moisture deficits, heat damage that's gonna hurt our plants and what have you, thus decreasing crop yield, which can lead to famine, and further decreasing the efficiency of our carbon sinks, therefore negating any of the positive impacts that may have happened due to air fertilization, photosynthesis.
Did we aggressively fight against some of the science? Yes. Did we join some of these shadow groups to work against some of the early efforts? Yes, that's true. But there's nothing illegal about that. You know, we were looking out for our investments.
So kids, what's the point? What's the opposite yapping on about today? Ultimately, what Peterson is doing is he's looking at the air fertilization in isolation, and he's placing it in light of the surprise that it may have presented to some climate scientists in order to argue that climate change, it's just a big hoax that the liberals want to coax on you. He communicates this through the very clever disguise of big words, ad hominem, information dumping. While he communicates so much in such a small amount of time with so much authority and gravitas, good for him.
If you're kind of fond of plants,
that an ordinary person with no time to fact check him can't help but to feel like, your boy's right. Can't argue with those facts. However, as I tried to demonstrate here, nothing he actually claims poses any contradiction to the climate crisis. Instead, actually, it can be explained by the climate crisis. Many such cases. In conclusion to this reaction, climate change is one of those subjects where after decades of being propagandized by fossil fuel companies and lobbyists, you can basically guarantee support from a more conservative audience by riling them up and accusing the liberals of wanting to destroy the future or the West or whatever. And the thing is, Peterson knows this, alright? He's not an intellectual, he's an emotional manipulator. And he utilizes big words, a fantastic vocabulary, and a doctorate as weapons against his conservative audience who are, just like you and me, confused and stumbling through this, God, abnormally disorienting life, just simply trying to get by and survive. But by manipulating the conservative, he can lead his audience in a direction of being angry, pissed off, and what have you. And in doing so, he divides the conservative audience from being able to empathize with and love their liberal neighbours, thus turning entire swaths of the population into the enemy. This is despite the fact that climate change fundamentally does not care about the distinctions between left and right political affiliations. If you are too poor to avoid the consequences of climate change, you will be swept away. Whilst Peterson may not believe in climate change, your insurance company does. Peterson's language is innately violent, but that can only be experienced and understood from the view of the people that he denigrates and dehumanizes. When he accuses environmentalists of being socialists and communists, his accusation is not designed to reflect a statistical or ideological reality, and even if it did, so what? Saying a thing is bad because of the people who believe or push a thing is stupid. His accusation is not designed to be accurate or astute. This is obvious to any conservative or moderate who is also an environmentalist. His accusation is designed to elicit a reaction in his conservative audience to conflate environmentalism with something that they hate. Thus, by so grossly misrepresenting environmentalists, their arguments, and their concerns, Peterson creates an artificial stumbling block between them and the conservative, making any kind of environmental or even theological reconciliation far more difficult. Does hatred, anger, and fear, all that gobshite, does it help us to love our neighbours? Does listening to Jordan Peterson and what he has to say about the annoying girl with blue hair? The annoying girl with blue hair!
Girl with blue hair. She had endured mental health struggles for 12 years.
Does that help us to love that girl? Jordan Peterson is a grifter, and he makes bastard money doing it. Thus, altogether, I have to conclude that his interests and the interests of the Sermon on the Mount contradict each other. No. I don't want to spend any more time interacting with Jordan Peterson. After all, I'm here to react to Christians and their content. However, Peterson was on Mr. Pints' podcast, where he was given a free platform to just say whatever boy wanted to say. And whilst I obviously don't seem to like that, I'm not gonna criticize Mr. Pints for doing. He can platform whoever he wants to platform, but I am gonna be critical of the lack of pushback. Now, to be charitable, as I've stated, it's very hard to push back against Peter. He says so damn much. You have to be really prepared to engage with him on whatever subject he's going to bring up, or you have to be educated on that subject in order to respond appropriately. But the thing is, Mr. Pints doesn't provide any pushback. Rather, he welcomes the claims of Peterson and seems to take them on quite well. This communicates to the audience that Peterson's claims, they're trustworthy. And because they were communicated on a Christian Catholic podcast, that also means that they are good for Christians to adopt. Thus, for the Christian listener, Peterson's arguments and his rhetoric, and the way he treats certain ideological people, they become conflated with Christian virtue, further syncretizing the weird marriage between Christianity and the kinds of regressive conservative politics that also just so happen to make corporations, CEOs, and online grifters lots of money. Therefore, can't really say I have anything positive to say in the 20-minute section. It's a bad section. But now that we're done responding to Mr. Pints' little podcast, up next on Theocracy, we're going to respond to...
And the thing about all this environmental stuff, if it's all true, he's also right in that you can't even do anything about it.
Yeah.
And this is me as a guy, and you can't even do anything about it.
Yeah, right. Now you think, well, no. It's like, well, wait a minute. Where did all this
As a guy,
nonsense come from?
Just listen to this.
my car now is a Tesla. I have solar panels.
Completely.
Can't even do anything about it.
Hey, yo, this is Bert the dog.
And this
He's
is
a good
me.
boy. Isn't that right?
Fellas, don't drink that.
Bert the dog.
And Peter's so nice.